Tulsi Gabbard just ended Ilhan Omar's career with undeniable evidence. The air in the Hart Senate office building was thick with anticipation, a charged silence that seemed to hum beneath the polished veneer of routine congressional proceedings, where everyday meetings were typically dry discussions about policy and budgets. But today, room 216 had transformed into a true arena where the fate of a political career could be decided in just a few hours, with watchful eyes from every corner of the room, from the gleaming wooden chairs to the stately walls etched with American history. The usual crowd of lobbyists and staffers was conspicuously absent, replaced by an eclectic mix of somber faces representing the pain and hopes of the nation, including families of victims from the horrific terrorist attacks, still clutching faded photographs of lost loved ones, as if those memories were the sole source of strength to endure decades of grief alongside Jewish community leaders, with resolute expressions, people who had seen history repeat itself too many times, with prejudices and discrimination sitting there with sharp eyes ready to witness justice being served. Then there were immigration attorneys armed with thick case files full of affidavits and evidence of injustices in the immigration system, and finally conservative journalists poised with phones and recorders to capture every moment, knowing this was not just a hearing, but an event that could shift the political landscape. This was no ordinary hearing on immigration policy oversight, though that's what Representative Ilhan Omar had been led to believe when she received the invitation, thinking it was just a familiar debate on borders and refugee rights. But the reality was entirely different. And she walked into the chamber with her trademark confidence. Her designer hijab meticulously arranged her navy blazer, projecting progressive authority, and a faint smile suggesting she had weathered countless storms before, from heated debates on television to relentless criticisms on social media, all of which had failed to shake her position as a symbol of diversity and the fight for equity. She had no inkling that she was stepping into a meticulously crafted trap, one orchestrated by Senator Tulsi Gabbard, a woman whose sharp intellect and unrelenting preparation had set the stage for what would later be called one of the most devastating political confrontations in modern American history, where truth would be laid bare without mercy, and long-standing contradictions would be exposed under the light of irrefutable evidence. Tulsi Gabbard, the senator from Hawaii, had built a reputation as a formidable figure in Washington, not through bombast or theatrics, but through her ability to wield facts with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. Her military background, having served in Iraq, with real battlefield experiences where she witnessed the sacrifices of comrades and the consequences of flawed political decisions, all forging a person unafraid to confront uncomfortable truths, lending her a unique authority marked by a relentless commitment to accountability and a knack for exposing contradictions with an authentic Hawaiian charm, a blend of a veteran's resilience and a leader's wisdom that made her a force not to be underestimated in congressional debates. For 3 months, Gabbard had worked in near-total secrecy, she and her team operating like a squad of investigators, assembling a case for a high-stakes trial, combing through every available record marriage certificates from civil offices, tax filings from the IRS, with detailed numbers on income, and expenditures, campaign finance reports from election commissions, and a decade's worth of social media posts archived meticulously from old tweets to Facebook entries, all analyzed to uncover the smallest inconsistencies, building a dossier that read like a federal prosecutor's dream, with each page packed with evidence cross-verified from multiple independent sources. This wasn't about embarrassing Omar, a senior aide had confided to colleagues the night before in a closed-door meeting, but about holding her accountable in a way that would resonate far beyond the walls of room 216. Influencing how the public viewed political ethics and the responsibilities of lawmakers. Gabbard's team had cross-referenced every contradiction, every questionable decision, from campaign fund usage to public statements sparking controversy, every inflammatory remark recorded from conference speeches to online posts creating a roadmap to unravel Omar's carefully curated public image, the one she had built over years as a trailblazing Muslim refugee woman of color fighting for the underrepresented. The senator herself had spent late nights poring over the evidence, consulting legal experts from prestigious law firms to ensure her questions would be unassailable, their implications inescapable, analyzing every detail from the historical context of statements to the legal ramifications of financial violations, all to guarantee that this confrontation was not just a debate, but a lesson in transparency and responsibility. As Omar settled into her seat, chatting casually with aides and glancing at her phone to check messages, the room's energy shifted subtly, a tension spreading like an undercurrent. Her staff, usually a confident entourage with smiles and quick advice, seemed uneasy exchanging hushed whispers as they noticed the unusual composition of the gallery, unfamiliar but meaningful faces from mothers who lost sons on 9/11s to community leaders who had waited for this moment for years. The presence of 9/11's families, their buttons pinned with faded photos of loved ones, should have been a glaring warning. Those images not just mementos, but symbols of national trauma, reminders of the day America changed forever. The immigration attorneys, clutching folders thick with affidavits from other refugees, hinted at scrutiny beyond policy debates, sitting with professional yet determined expressions, their files seeming weighted with the potential ties to larger immigration system issues, and the Jewish community leaders, some of whom had waited years for a moment like this, sat with quiet determination, their eyes fixed on the woman at the witness table, recalling specific statements and their impacts on their community. However, Omar appeared oblivious to the gathering storm, maintaining her calm exterior, for she had faced criticism before on cable news, with intense interviews on social media, with thousands of negative comments in the halls of Congress, with fiery arguments, and had always emerged unscathed, her identity as a trailblazing Muslim refugee woman of color, serving as both shield and sword, protecting her from attacks that might fell others. She had no reason to suspect this hearing would be any different. But it was. This was a trap designed to exploit the very strengths she thought were invulnerable. The trap had been set with surgical precision, and Tulsi Gabbard was about to spring it. The chamber's heavy wooden doors swung open, and Senator Tulsi Gabbard entered her presence, commanding attention without a word, with her military bearing straight and confident. Honed from the front lines, she carried herself as someone who had faced real adversity and triumphed her tailored suit, a nod to her Hawaiian roots rather than Washington's, flash a combination of simplicity and power that demanded respect. Her eyes, sharp and assessing, scanned the room briefly before settling on Omar, a faint smile playing at the corners of her mouth, not the smile of a predator, but of a leader who knew the weight of the evidence she carried, and the clarity of the truth she intended to reveal. It was a smile of confidence rooted in thorough preparation, not arrogance. Gabbard took her seat at the committee table, her movements deliberate, her stack of documents neatly arranged before her like a weapon ready for use. The gallery fell silent, the air crackling with the kind of tension that precedes a historic reckoning. Veteran reporters who had covered everything from military scandals to impeachment trials later said they'd never felt a room so electric before. A hearing even began. They recognized the signs. This was no routine oversight session. This was a moment designed to change the trajectory of a political career, with consequences that could ripple across parties and voters. The chairman's gavel struck its sharp crack, echoing like the opening shot of a duel. "The committee will come to order," he announced, his voice carrying an unusual gravity that hinted at the stakes. "Today we examine critical questions about the integrity of our immigration system, the accountability of campaign finance practices, and the responsibilities of those entrusted to represent the American people." The coded language was unmistakable to anyone versed in Washington's subtext. This wasn't about broad policy, but about one specific representative whose actions had raised serious questions about ethics, honesty, and loyalty to national values. Gabbard adjusted her notes, her expression one of calm resolve, and leaned slightly toward the microphone. "Representative Omar, thank you for joining us today." She began, her voice warm but precise, each word chosen with care to set the initial tone. "I know your time is valuable, and I appreciate your willingness to help us clarify some important matters." The courtesy was disarming, almost collegial, but those familiar with Gabbard's style recognized it as the opening move in a carefully choreographed strategy. She wasn't here to trade barbs or score cheap points. She was here to ask questions that demanded answers, questions that would expose truths Omar had long avoided, truths about statements, finances, and personal conduct. Omar nodded, her smile tight but polite. "Thank you, Senator Gabbard. I'm happy to be here and answer any questions you may have." She replied, her voice steady but tinged with the weariness of someone who sensed an undercurrent of danger. She had faced hostile hearings before, navigated tricky interviews, and deflected accusations with practiced ease. But Gabbard's demeanor, calm, respectful, almost deferential, carried a subtle menace that set this encounter apart. She wasn't shouting or grandstanding. She was setting the stage, establishing a baseline of civility that would make her forthcoming questions all the more devastating. "That's kind of you," Gabbard said, glancing at her notes with the unhurried deliberation of a woman who had all the time in the world. "I'd like to start with some straightforward questions to establish a foundation for our discussion, just to ensure we're all on the same page." The simplicity of the request belied its strategic intent. Gabbard was laying the groundwork, locking in facts that would become critical when she began to unravel the contradictions in Omar's record. "Representative Omar, you arrived in the United States as a refugee from Somalia. Is that correct?" Gabbard asked, her tone neutral, but her eyes fixed on her, reading her reaction, observing every micro-expression for signs of sincerity. "Yes, that's correct," Omar replied, her voice measured. "I was young when my family arrived." Gabbard nodded, as if confirming a minor detail. "And prior to that, you spent several years in a refugee camp in Kenya, correct?" "Yes, we lived in the Dadaab refugee camp after fleeing Somalia," she answered, still composed, but sensing the conversation's direction, a direction that could lead to more treacherous territory. "That must have been a challenging experience," Gabbard said, her voice carrying a note of sympathy that felt genuine, but served a deeper purpose, drawing from her own wartime experiences. "I imagine you and your family were deeply grateful for the opportunities this country provided." The comment was perfectly crafted, acknowledging her story while subtly framing her obligations to the nation that had welcomed her, a nation Gabbard had defended with her life. Omar recognized the nuance but had little choice but to agree. "We were very grateful for the chance to build a new life in America," she said. "This country gave my family and me opportunities we could never have imagined." Gabbard's smile widened slightly, a flicker of satisfaction in her eyes. "I'm glad to hear that," she said, her tone still warm, but now carrying an edge of purpose. "Now I'd like to discuss how you've used those opportunities, particularly in your role as a representative of the American people." The transition was seamless, shifting from her personal story to her public conduct, setting the stage for the real interrogation to begin. The gallery leaned forward, reporters' pens poised. The 9/11's family's eyes unblinking, Omar's aides shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing the shift in tone. The senator's opening had been polite, even deferential, but it was clear now that Tulsi Gabbard was not here to exchange pleasantries. She was here to hold Ilhan Omar accountable, to shine a light on the contradictions and controversies that had defined her career, and to do so with a clarity and precision that would leave no room for evasion. The trap was set, and the reckoning was about to begin, a reckoning that would leave an indelible mark on political history, where truth would ultimately triumph over layers of obfuscation, and those representing the people would have to face the consequences of their actions. The room's atmosphere was no longer one of mere anticipation, but the start of a storm with Gabbard at the center, ready to guide the conversation into deeper waters where secrets and inconsistencies would be dragged to the surface, forcing everyone to reconsider trust and responsibility in the democratic system. Omar sitting there with her composure still intact but perhaps feeling the shift inwardly, the tension spreading from the audience to her colleagues, and Gabbard continued with her steady voice, masterfully steering the discussion, ensuring everything unfolded according to the plan laid out in those months of secret preparation. This was the moment history was made, not through grand speeches, but through simple yet incisive questions that would shake the foundations of a career and remind us of the power of truth in a democratic society through each meticulously prepared query, each carefully gathered piece of evidence painting a comprehensive picture of what lay behind the public persona. From the small details like how Gabbard arranged her documents to how Omar adjusted her posture, everything contributed to the larger narrative, a narrative of justice and accountability. And Gabbard, with her unwavering resolve, was leading it to its climax. The atmosphere in room 216 had shifted from tense anticipation to a charged battlefield of words, where every syllable carried weight and the emotional undercurrents rippled through the audience like waves crashing against a fragile shore. Senator Tulsi Gabbard sat at the committee table with her demeanor as calm and deliberate as ever, her military-honed focus evident in the way she held her posture straight and unyielding, but her eyes betrayed a laser-like intensity, fixed on Representative Ilhan Omar, who sat across from her at the witness table, her earlier confidence now tempered by a flicker of unease that manifested in the subtle tightening of her fingers around her notes, as if grasping for stability in a room that felt increasingly unstable. The gallery packed to capacity with 9/11's families clutching their cherished photographs like lifelines to the past Jewish community leaders whose faces bore the weight of generational resilience, immigration attorneys with their stacks of affidavits, symbolizing untold stories of struggle, and reporters whose pens hovered expectantly over notebooks, hung on every word, exchanged their collective silence, amplifying the stakes of the moment to an almost unbearable pitch, where even the faintest rustle of paper sounded like thunder in the hushed space. Gabbard had already laid the foundation in her opening questions, establishing a seemingly innocuous timeline of Omar's life that traced her journey from a Somali refugee camp to the halls of Congress. But this groundwork was designed with strategic foresight to anchor the more piercing inquiries to come inquiries that would probe not just facts, but the very essence of judgment and empathy. And now she was ready to pivot to the heart of her case, zeroing in on Omar's public statements that had ignited widespread outrage for their perceived insensitivity and moral ambiguity. Her goal extending beyond mere challenge to revealing what those words signified about fitness for public office, all while the audience's reactions served as a living barometer of the nation's unresolved wounds. With a steady voice that echoed her Hawaiian roots blended with battlefield resolve, Gabbard leaned slightly toward the microphone, her tone polite but firm, like a commander addressing a critical briefing. "Representative Omar, I'd like to discuss some of your public statements that have caused significant concern among Americans, particularly those related to the events of September 11th. She began, and immediately the gallery stirred subtly, a 9/11's widow in the second row, clutching her faded photo of her husband tighter, her breath catching audibly as memories flooded back her eyes, welling with tears that spoke volumes about the enduring pain that no amount of time could fully heal. In that charged instant, the room felt smaller, more intimate, as Gabbard continued referencing a 2019 speech at a fundraising event for the Council on American-Islamic Relations. "You said, and I quote, 'CARE was founded after 9/11's because they recognized that some people did something and that all of us were starting to lose access to our civil liberties.' Did I quote that accurately, ma'am?" The question was deceptively simple, its precision slicing through the air like a well-aimed arrow stripping away any ambiguity. and forcing Omar to confront the phrase that had become a flashpoint for criticism. And, as it hung there, a low murmur rippled through the 9/11's families, one father who had lost his daughter in the towers, shaking his head slowly, his face etched with disbelief and fresh anguish, whispering to the person beside him, in a voice barely audible but heavy with emotion, as if the casual wording reopened scars that had never fully closed. Omar's posture stiffened, her hands folding tightly in front of her, as she recognized this familiar line of attack, one she had defended numerous times in media appearances and congressional corridors, but here, under Gabbard's unflinching gaze, and amid this particular audience, it felt freshly perilous. "Yes, Senator, those were my words," she replied, her voice steady but cautious, laced with a hint of defensiveness. But they were part of a broader discussion about the impact of 9/11's on civil liberties, particularly for Muslim Americans who faced discrimination in the aftermath. And, as she spoke, a young man in the gallery, whose brother had perished as a first responder, leaned forward, his jaw-clenched eyes narrowing in quiet fury, the explanation ringing hollow against the backdrop of his personal loss, where some people did something, diminished the calculated evil that shattered so many lives. Gabbard nodded, her expression one of apparent understanding, but her eyes never wavered, holding Omar's gaze with the intensity of someone who had seen real combat and knew the cost of vague language in matters of national security. "I appreciate the context, ma'am, but I'd like to focus on the specific language you chose, describing the deadliest terrorist attack in American history as some people did something. Can you help the committee understand why you used such understated terms for an event that claimed nearly 3,000 lives?" The question lingered its simplicity, belying a devastating intent, inviting Omar to explain a choice that seemed indefensible to many. And in the gallery, the widow's tears finally spilled over her shoulders, shaking silently as she dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. The pain not just personal, but communal, shared among the families who exchanged glances of solidarity. Their buttons and photos, a silent chorus, demanding acknowledgement of the full horror. Omar shifted slightly in her seat, her eyes narrowing as she weighed her response. The weight of the room's eyes upon her palpable. "Senator, my focus was on the broader policy implications, not on minimizing the tragedy," she said, her voice carrying a hint of frustration that echoed through the space, but this only intensified the gallery's unrest, with another family member, a sister who had lost her sibling, covering her mouth to stifle a sob, her body language screaming that policy discussions could never eclipse the human cost. The deliberate act of terror that tore families apart. Gabbard tilted her head, her expression one of genuine curiosity, tempered by her veteran's perspective on threats, though those who knew her style recognized it as a prelude to a sharper dissection. "I understand your focus on policy, ma'am, but let's be clear about the facts. The 9/11's attacks were carried out by 19 al-Qaeda terrorists who hijacked 4 commercial planes, deliberately targeting civilians. Do you agree with that description?" Omar nodded her response, clipped and measured. "Yes, that's accurate." But Gabbard pressed forward relentlessly, her voice unwavering like a steady march. "Then why not say that? Why not say, after al-Qaeda's terrorist attacks? Or after the murder of nearly 3,000 Americans? Why choose words that make it sound like a minor incident, like, some people did something?" The repetition of the phrase was deliberate, each utterance hammering home its casual tone in stark contrast to the horror it described. And the gallery stirred more audibly now, a low murmur of agreement and dismay spreading among the 9/11's families. One man gripping the armrest so tightly, his knuckles whitened, his face flushed with a mix of anger and validation, as if Gabbard's words articulated the betrayal they had felt for years. The Jewish community leaders, seated nearby, leaned in closer, their resolute expressions deepening into quiet resolve, sensing the pivot toward related issues of moral clarity, while immigration attorneys flipped through their fills, subtly their professional detachment cracking slightly under the emotional tide. Omar's jaw tightened, but she maintained her composure amid the rising tension. "Senator, I wasn't trying to downplay the tragedy," she said, her tone more defensive now, edging toward exasperation. "My point was about the consequences for civil liberties." And, as these words landed, a ripple of headshakes swept through the families, the widow whispering to her companion, her voice choked with emotion, the detachment in Omar's defense amplifying their sense of erasure, as if their loved one's sacrifices were mere footnotes to policy debates. Gabbard leaned back slightly, her fingers tapping lightly on her notes, in a gesture that seemed casual, but was calculated to draw attention to the stack of evidence at her disposal. "I hear you, ma'am, but words matter, especially when you're a member of Congress representing people who lost loved ones that day, when you call the murderers some people and their actions something. It sounds like you're avoiding the moral weight of what happened. Let me ask you directly, do you believe the 9/11 attacks were a deliberate act of evil by Islamic terrorists, or do you see them as just something that happened?" The question was a masterstroke, forcing Omar into a corner where affirmation was expected, but any hesitation would resonate deeply, and the gallery held its breath, the father's eyes boring into Omar with unblinking intensity, his grief transforming into a silent demand for unequivocal condemnation. Omar's pause was brief but noticeable, her eyes flicking momentarily to her aides before returning to Gabbard. "Senator, I believe the attacks were a horrific act of terrorism, and I mourn the loss of every life," she said, her voice careful but lacking the raw conviction the moment seemed to crave, prompting a soft gasp from the sister in the audience, her hand trembling as she clutched her necklace, a memento from her lost sibling, the response feeling insufficient against the backdrop of their shared trauma. Gabbard's smile was faint, almost sympathetic, drawing from her own experiences with loss in service. But her next question cut deeper. "I'm glad you say that, ma'am, but your words in that speech didn't convey mourning. They conveyed a kind of detachment that many found troubling." Let me share a perspective to illustrate why this matters. A man named Nicholas Harros, Jr., whose mother died in the World Trade Center, spoke at a 9/11 memorial ceremony wearing a shirt with your words, "Some people did something," and said, "Madam, objectively speaking, we know who and what was done. There is no uncertainty about that. Why your confusion?" How would you respond to Mr. Harros and the families who felt your words minimized their loss? The citation of a specific victim's son was powerful, grounding Gabbard's critique in the real visceral pain of those affected, and the gallery's silence grew heavier, the weight of the moment palpable as the widow nodded vigorously, her tears flowing freely, now finding in Gabbard's words a voice for their long-suppressed outrage, while other families exchanged nods of agreement, their collective grief forming an invisible wall around Omar. Omar's response was measured, but her discomfort was evident in the way she adjusted her hijab slightly. "I regret that my words caused pain to anyone. Senator," she said, "my intent was to highlight the discrimination faced by Muslim Americans, not to diminish the tragedy." And though her voice held firm, the gallery's reaction was a subtle wave of dissatisfaction, with the young man crossing his arms tightly, his expression hardening into one of unresolved hurt, the regret acknowledged, but the impact undiminished in their eyes. Gabbard nodded, her expression one of thoughtful consideration, but her tone sharpened just enough to signal she wasn't satisfied. "I appreciate your regret, ma'am, but intent doesn't erase impact when a member of Congress describes the worst attack on American soil since Pearl Harbor. In such vague terms, it raises questions about your understanding of the threats we face. Let's move to another statement that's raised similar concerns," she said, flipping a page in her notes with a deliberate care, the gesture drawing every eye in the room, including the Jewish leaders, who straightened imperceptibly, anticipating the shift to allegations of anti-Semitism that had long simmered in their communities. In 2019, you tweeted, "It's all about the Benjamin's baby." In response to criticism of your stance on Israel, can you explain what you meant by suggesting that support for Israel is driven by money? The pivot was seamless, moving from 9/11's insensitivity to accusations of invoking harmful tropes, and the Jewish leaders in the gallery leaned forward collectively, their faces a mix of anticipation and steely resolve. One rabbi clenching his fist subtly under the table, his eyes reflecting the pain of historical echoes where such language had fueled discrimination and violence against his people. Omar's eyes narrowed her voice, taking on a defensive edge that cut through the room's tension. "Senator, I was commenting on the influence of lobbying groups, specifically AIPAC, in shaping pro-Israel policies," she said. But Gabbard tilted her head with polite skepticism, her veteran's insight into alliances adding depth to her probe. "So you were suggesting that American support for Israel, our closest democratic ally in the Middle East, is primarily about financial influence rather than shared values or security interests?" The question was razor-sharp, exposing the problematic implication that Jewish money-not principle drove policy, and a murmur of agreement rose from the Jewish section, a community organizer whispering urgently to her neighbor, her expression one of vindication mixed with sorrow, as if the tweet's resurrection here validated years of unease. Omar replied firmly but strained, "I was criticizing the role of money in politics broadly." Yet Gabbard's smile was slight, almost regretful. "With respect, ma'am, you didn't criticize money in politics broadly. You singled out AIPAC, a Jewish organization, and implied their donations, the Benjamins, were the reason for support of Israel. You didn't say that about farm lobbies or environmental groups. Why focus on Jewish influence specifically?" The question struck at the core of the anti-Semitism allegations, and the gallery's Jewish leaders reacted visibly, one elder nodding slowly with a heavy sigh, his face lined with the fatigue of battling such stereotypes, while others exchanged glances of quiet solidarity, the room's emotional temperature rising, as the immigration attorneys observed with furrowed brows, connecting the dots to broader issues of bias in public discourse. Omar's response came quickly, carrying a hint of exasperation that only heightened the tension. "Senator, I believe all lobbying should be scrutinized," she said. But Gabbard's eyes narrowed slightly, her voice remaining calm yet relentless, like a persistent tide. "I agree scrutiny is important, ma'am, but your tweet wasn't about lobbying in general. It was about Jewish lobbying, and it echoed a dangerous trope about Jewish financial control. Let's look at another example. In 2012, you tweeted that Israel has hypnotized the world and called their actions evil doings. Can you explain why you chose such language?" Omar's composure faltered her pause longer. This time the gallery hanging on the silence, a Jewish leader covering her mouth in shock, her eyes wide with the sting of words that evoked conspiracy theories long used to marginalize her community. "That was a comment from before I entered Congress, Senator, and I've apologized for it." Omar said, her voice quieter, almost subdued, but Gabbard nodded firmly, her tone growing more insistent. "I'm glad you apologized, ma'am, but you were 30 years old, not a teenager suggesting Israel hypnotizes. The world sounds like a conspiracy theory about Jewish manipulation. Why use those words?" The unyielding question exposed a pattern, and the room knew it, with the rabbi's shoulders slumping slightly in a mix of relief and exhaustion, as if Gabbard's persistence was a balm for wounds inflicted by such rhetoric, the emotional responses in the gallery weaving a tapestry of grief, anger, and hope for accountability. As the interrogation deepened, Gabbard shifted gears to financial and legal irregularities, her voice maintaining its steady cadence. "Representative Omar, I'd like to move our discussion to some financial and legal matters that have raised serious questions about your conduct as an elected official." She began, and the immigration attorneys perked up their files, rustling as they anticipated ties to personal history, while the 9/11's families watched with renewed interest, sensing a broader erosion of trust. These issues involved the trust placed in you by the American people, particularly the hard-working folks who contribute to your campaigns, expecting their money to be used appropriately. Gabbard continued her words landing, like measured strikes, prompting Omar's eyes to narrow as she braced. "I understand, Senator. I'm ready to address any questions you have." But her caution was evident, and, in the gallery, a donor-like figure among the observers frowned, his expression one of betrayal at the hint of misuse. Gabbard detailed findings from the Minnesota Campaign Finance and Public Disclosure Board. Is it correct that the board found multiple violations of state campaign finance rules? Omar nodded clippedly. Yes, there were some technical issues that were addressed and corrected promptly, framing them as minor, but Gabbard pressed with specifics. The board found you used campaign funds for personal travel, unrelated to duties like trips to New York, Washington, D.C., Chicago, and Florida. Can you confirm? The recitation of destinations made the violations tangible, and a reporter scribbled furiously while an immigration attorney whispered to a colleague, their faces reflecting concern over integrity in representation. Omar hesitated, her fingers tightening. The board determined certain expenses didn't meet criteria, she said, but Gabbard leaned forward. These weren't clerical errors. You used donor funds for airfare to New York, for a meeting hotel in D.C., for a conference, travel to Chicago for an award, and Florida for an honorarium, reimbursing $3,469 and paying a $500 penalty. Accurate. The details elicited uneasy shifts in the gallery, the Jewish leader exchanging a glance with a 9/11's family member, their shared skepticism palpable. Omar complied. Yes, I made the reimbursements. But Gabbard highlighted the pattern. This suggests using campaign funds as a personal account. Why were these trips enhancing your profile paid with donor money? The framing as betrayal stirred reporters to note reactions, and the widow's eyes hardened, seeing parallels in diminished accountability. Moving to tax issues. Gabbard noted, the board also found $1,500 used for personal tax preparation. Confirm. Omar strained, related to campaign taxes. But Gabbard countered, the board found it for personal returns ordering repayment, prompting a gasp from an attorney, their professional outrage mirroring the gallery's growing disillusionment. Then came the thunderbolt. Were these tax issues related to joint filings with Ahmed Hirsi, while legally married to Ahmed Noor Said Elmi? The question connected dots explosively. The gallery gasping audibly, a Jewish organizer's eyes widening in shock at the complexity, Omar freezing before responding, filings were corrected. But Gabbard sharpened, you filed as married to one while bound to another, not a minor error, a serious legal issue. Explain. The room fell deathly silent, every eye on Omar as she struggled. The situation was complicated due to religious aspects, her words careful but unconvincing, eliciting headshakes from families, their pain now intertwined with doubts about honesty. Gabbard remained steady. Federal law doesn't recognize undocumented religious marriages. Sounds like fraudulent returns, fair. Omar's agonizing pause tensed aides. I corrected the filings, she whispered. But Gabbard nodded unsatisfactorily. Correcting doesn't erase it. Finally, to payments, your campaign paid over $369,000 to E Street Group, owned by Tim Minette. Now your husband, correct. Omar nodded uncomfortably. We married later. But Gabbard, devastated. Divorce filings show he admitted an affair with you during payments, raises questions about subsidizing a relationship with campaign funds. The accusation buzzed through the gallery, whispers erupting, Jewish leaders united in disapproval with families, the emotional catharsis peaking as Omar defended payments for legitimate services. But her strained voice rang hollow against the collective outrage, Gabbard's questions not just challenging but stirring souls, turning the hearing into a profound communal reckoning where grief, resolve, and scrutiny converged in a symphony of human response. The silence in room 216 was deafening, a heavy pause that seemed to swallow the air as Senator Tulsi Gabbard sat back in her chair, her work nearly complete, the echoes of her final questions lingering like the fading notes of a somber symphony. Representative Ilhan Omar, once a commanding presence at the witness table, with her poised demeanor and articulate defenses, now appeared diminished, her earlier confidence eroded by the relentless tide of evidence-based inquiries that had peeled back layers of controversy exposing vulnerabilities not just in her record, but in the broader fabric of political accountability. The gallery filled with 9/11's families whose faces bore the raw etchings of grief, Jewish community leaders radiating a quiet sense of vindication after years of unease, immigration attorneys clutching their affidavits as symbols of systemic scrutiny, and reporters whose frantic note-taking had captured the drama unfold, watched with rapt attention, their expressions a complex mosaic of shock at the revelations, vindication for long-held suspicions, and subdued outrage that simmered beneath the surface, ready to ignite broader conversations beyond this confined space. Gabbard had meticulously unraveled Omar's record, weaving together threads of dismissive remarks on national tragedies, alleged invocations of divisive tropes, and tangled webs of financial improprieties. But now, in this concluding phase of the hearing, she prepared to tie it all together, not through further confrontation or personal barbs, but with a broader, reflective lesson about the sacred responsibilities of public office, a lesson that transcended the individuals involved and spoke to the soul of the nation, one that would echo in policy discussions, community forums, and even educational curricula for generations to come, emphasizing that leadership in a democracy demands not just ambition, but an unwavering adherence to principles of honesty, empathy, and unity. With a measured adjustment of her glasses, Gabbard leaned toward the microphone for her closing salvo, her voice carrying the steady timbre of someone who had faced the chaos of war and emerged with a profound respect for truth's enduring power. Representative Omar, we've covered a lot of ground today. She began her tone as courteous as ever, but infused with a gravitas that signaled the end game a moment to synthesize the fragments into a cohesive narrative of caution. We've discussed your statements about the September 11th attacks, your financial dealings, and the legal questions surrounding your personal and campaign conduct. I want to give you a chance to respond, but first, let me summarize what we've established. And as she spoke, the gallery leaned forward in unison, pens poised not just for quotes, but for the philosophical underpinnings that Gabbard was about to unveil, her words methodically recounting the evidence without the emotional immediacy of the interrogation, instead framing it as a case study in ethical lapses. You described the worst terrorist attack in American history as some people did something, a phrase that many, including 9/11's families, found deeply dismissive and detached from the human suffering it entailed. You've made statements suggesting undue influence in foreign policy that invoke historical prejudices, alienating communities and raising doubts about inclusive representation. You've violated campaign finance laws by diverting donor funds for personal travel and tax services, eroding the trust inherent in public stewardship. And you've navigated tax filings and campaign payments in ways that suggest conflicts of interest, particularly involving personal relationships that blur professional boundaries, taken together. These issues paint a picture of someone who has struggled to uphold the trust placed in you by the American people, a trust that forms the bedrock of our democratic institutions. How do you respond? Omar's face was a mask of controlled frustration, her hands clasped tightly, as if anchoring herself against the summation's weight, searching for words that could reframe the narrative in a light of resilience and advocacy. Senator Gabbard, I reject the characterization that I've betrayed anyone's trust. She said, her voice firm but strained, carrying the echo of battles fought on behalf of marginalized voices. Any errors were inadvertent, and my statements have been consistently taken out of context to attack me. My focus has always been on serving my constituents and advocating for justice, equity, and policies that uplift the underserved, from healthcare reforms to environmental protections. Gabbard's expression remained impassive, her eyes holding a glint of resolve forged in the fires of public service and military duty, acknowledging the response without concession. "I hear you, ma'am, but the American people don't judge their leaders by intentions alone. They judge us by our actions, our words, and the patterns they reveal, patterns that, when they include legal violations, questionable financial dealings, and rhetoric that divides rather than unites, transcend context, and demand accountability, a principle that safeguards the integrity of our republic." Her words landed with the force of a gavel, though no actual strike followed yet, and the gallery stirred gently, the 9/11's families exchanging glances of quiet agreement. Their pain not just validated, but elevated into a call for higher standards, while Jewish leaders nodded with a sense of closure, seeing in Gabbard's framework a pathway to healing communal rifts through transparent dialogue. Gabbard paused, allowing the summary to permeate the room like a thoughtful meditation before delivering her final point, with a somber tone that evoked the wisdom of statesmen past. "Ma'am, the role of a member of Congress comes with profound responsibilities. You represent not just your district, but the values of this nation, values like honesty that builds trust, integrity that withstands scrutiny, and respect for those who've sacrificed for our freedoms, from veterans on foreign fields to families enduring unimaginable loss at home. When you minimize national tragedies, when you use campaign funds for personal gain, when you invoke language that sows division, you undermine those values, eroding the very foundation of our shared democracy. My question is simple. Can you commit here and now to upholding the standards of transparency and moral clarity that the American people expect from their leaders, standards that ensure our government remains of the people, by the people, and for the people?" The question was a masterstroke of rhetorical elegance, forcing Omar into a position where a pledge could signal growth or evasion, might underscore defiance, and her pause stretched long, her eyes darting briefly to her aides in a moment of vulnerability before she spoke with a voice that aimed for conviction but landed in the realm of measured diplomacy. "Senator, I've always worked to serve my constituents and uphold the values of this country, committing to ongoing efforts for justice and inclusivity." Yet the response, while principled, lacked the unequivocal embrace of the standards Gabbard outlined, leaving the room to absorb the nuance, or lack thereof, as the chairman called for a recess, the gavel's crack signaling not just the end of the session but the beginning of a ripple effect that would extend far beyond these walls. As committee members filed out and the gallery began to empty in a slow procession, whispers evolved into murmurs, then into a crescendo of animated discussions that spilled into the corridors, reporters scrambling to their laptops and phones to file stories that would dominate headlines, crafting narratives of a rare Washington moment, where facts triumphed over spin, with clips of Gabbard's key summations circulating online, almost instantaneously shared by commentators across the spectrum who hailed her methodical approach as a masterclass in principled leadership, one that avoided vitriol in favor of substantive discourse. Mainstream outlets, often cautious in navigating such controversies, found themselves compelled to highlight the evidence's inescapability. One anchor describing it as a pivotal juncture in accountability, while another noted how Gabbard's framing elevated the hearing from partisan skirmish to ethical imperative. Jewish community organizations issued statements, not just praising the address of painful rhetoric, but advocating for educational initiatives to combat tropes in public discourse, fostering dialogues in synagogues and schools about the power of words in shaping societal harmony. Meanwhile, 9/11's families expressed profound gratitude in press releases and social media posts, their voices amplified by the hearing's visibility, speaking of how Gabbard's emphasis on moral clarity honored their loved ones' sacrifices, inspiring memorial foundations to launch campaigns for civic education on national resilience, turning personal grief into catalysts for communal strength. The political fallout was immediate and seismic, rippling through corridors of power and grassroots networks. Alike, Omar's allies in Congress rallied to her defense, with statements framing the hearing as a targeted assault on progressive voices, particularly those of women of color, challenging the status quo. But even among these supporters, private conversations revealed a tempered vigor, with some acknowledging the need for introspection on ethical boundaries, leading to internal party discussions on strengthening compliance training for campaign finances. In Omar's Minneapolis district, polls, though unofficial in the immediate aftermath, showed a sharp dip in approval ratings, not just among general voters, but within the Somali-American community, where leaders who had once championed her as a beacon of representation now voiced measured disappointment, calling for town halls focused on transparency and cultural sensitivity. Their trust shaken, not by the questions alone, but by the broader implications for community advocacy in a polarized landscape. Fundraising, once a powerhouse for Omar's campaigns through small-dollar donations from progressive networks, plummeted as contributors hesitated, wary of the allegations now indelibly linked to her name, prompting a shift in donor strategies toward organizations emphasizing ethical governance, thereby reshaping the financial ecosystem of left-leaning politics. Legal implications loomed large, with bipartisan calls for deeper investigations into potential campaign finance violations and tax irregularities gaining traction in oversight committees. Legal analysts on cable news dissecting how Gabbard's public summation had effectively constructed a roadmap for prosecutors, making it politically untenable for authorities to sideline the issues, potentially leading to reforms in federal election laws to close loopholes on personal use of funds. Yet the true significance of the hearing transcended these immediate reverberations, embedding itself in the national psyche as a timeless lesson on the fragility and resilience of democratic institutions, where truth, when pursued with preparation, civility, and an eye toward unity, could pierce through the cacophony of political noise. Gabbard, drawing from her military ethos of duty and honor, had demonstrated that leadership need not be a quest for dominance, but a dedication to principle, offering a blueprint for future confrontations that prioritized facts over factionalism, inspiring a wave of op-eds and think tank papers on ethical auditing in governance. For the public at large, the event served as a stark reminder that public service is a privilege laden with accountability, not a shield against scrutiny, prompting citizen-led initiatives like voter education workshops on evaluating candidates' records, where communities from urban centers to rural heartlands gathered to discuss the values that bind the nation, honesty as the currency of trust, integrity as the guardian of progress, and respect as the bridge across divides. Aspiring leaders from local council hopefuls to national figures viewed the hearing as a case study in integrity, incorporating its lessons into leadership training programs at universities and military academies, where Gabbard's approach was analyzed for its balance of firmness and fairness, fostering a new generation committed to transparent service. As the dust settled over weeks and months, the message crystallized: when leaders falter in upholding the public trust, the consequences must be met not with rancor but through the relentless pursuit of truth, a pursuit that strengthens the democratic tapestry rather than tearing it asunder. Americans, absorbing the clips and analyses in living rooms and online forums, experienced a renewed sense of agency, demanding more from their representatives. Transparency that illuminates decisions, accountability that corrects course, and moral clarity that honors the sacrifices of forebears, from the Founding Fathers' vision to the everyday heroes of modern crises. The reckoning in Room 216 evolved into more than a political episode. It became a catalyst for societal renewal, urging every citizen to engage actively in the democratic process, from voting with informed discernment to participating in civic dialogues that bridge ideological chasms, ensuring that the nation's values remain vibrant and inclusive. Gabbard's legacy, burnished by this moment, positioned her as a bridge builder in an era of division, her Hawaiian heritage, symbolizing the aloha spirit of mutual respect, applied to national challenges, inspiring cross-partisan coalitions on issues like veteran support and ethical reforms. Beyond the immediate actors, the hearing sparked broader societal reflections. Immigrant communities, including Somali Americans, convened forums to explore themes of gratitude intertwined with advocacy, balancing cultural pride with national loyalty in ways that enriched the American mosaic. Educational institutions integrated the event into curricula on civics and media literacy, teaching students to discern fact from narrative in an age of information overload. And even international observers noted its impact, citing it as an example of self-correcting democracy that could inform global governance models. Ultimately, the hearing reaffirmed America's enduring promise, a nation where truth prevails. Service elevates the collective good over individual ambition, and every voice tempered by responsibility contributes to the ongoing experiment in liberty and justice for all. A promise that through moments like this is continually renewed and fortified against the tests of time.